Your daddy's got nothing on
The
me.
history of Star, it started in 1977. Just like a lot of comic book stores back then, you had a sequential storytelling format. People had to follow it from issue to issue to find out what happens next. And it became really unreliable to find them at the grocery store, the drugstore, and people wanted to be able to follow them specifically for that reason. And so the comic book store was born. Star Books and Comics was part of that, the very beginning of that boom. It was a very early part of the what's called the direct market, where you have specialty shops that sell comics to the public. I started coming to the store as a child because my uncle owned Star Books and Comics. So in 1981, my uncle purchased Star Books and Comics, and it became his store. As they say, I never looked back, so I always became a fan of comics through him. He grew up as a comic book enthusiast and just loved fantasy and science fiction and all the things that came with it. For me, it was 1977 when the store opened. My uncle gave me these really large editions of movie adaptations of Star Wars, which I was a huge fan of. And this was before I could read. So we didn't have VCRs in 1977. We didn't have DVD players. You couldn't watch your favorite movie over and over again. But I could revisit this movie that I love so much in comic books. And I could look at every single panel. It helped me learn to read because I knew what they were saying. I remembered what they were saying in certain parts. That was a direct comparison to cinema. Two forms of entertainment which are great at storytelling, but in two different ways. And I could kind of put that together at such a young age. That's one of my earliest memories. I started working here when I was in junior high school. I went to junior high at Ola Slayton Junior High, just down the street. So I would come up here after school when I was still in the 9th grade at the time. And then during high school, I worked here after school. I worked here all through college. Then when I got a professional career, I still worked here on the weekends. I was always involved in it in some capacity. The fuel of the boom was artists and writers started to become rock stars, so to speak, in the comic book world. Although they were always known prior to that, to the boom, they weren't quite given the recognition for the sales and the support of the books themselves. Well, around that time period, a few artists especially broke out of that mold as being able, it's like an actor who's able to create a blockbuster just off of their name. Well, some of these artists were able to create sales just off of their name, so they decided to separate from the big two companies, Marvel and DC, and create their own company called Image Comics. And that was kind of the beginning of the boom, is the recognition of seeing some of these people as stars. We already had a healthy clientele, but it was an introduction to a whole new generation of people to comic books. It was a different clientele, but it definitely increased the attention that comics received. You had hundreds of thousands of people, up to millions of people interested in comic books, however, for the wrong reasons. The headlines were always, comics become valuable, comics found in attic, $10,000, $15,000, $100,000. That still happens today. We still read those headlines. But what wasn't being focused on was the absolute rarity and why those particular comics were valuable. People were buying into that thinking that there was a cash in someday. And just like any trend when it comes to finances, they were trying to cash in 4 or 5 years later after the big boom, and they realized there was no value there. And just like any market crash, too many people cashing in on something that had no value, it chased people away faster than they were coming in. Sam Raimi really approached the Spider-Man franchise from a fan. He was a fan of Spider-Man, and you could tell that just in the storytelling and the creation of that first movie. And it really did. Prior to that would have been Bryan Singer's X-Men. Same thing. there was a storytelling device used in the movies that comics had been doing all along, but now a really big audience was introduced to how these characters, how these stories, especially the superhero genre, how it could capture the imagination of young and old, something that people had just forgotten about or had never been exposed to prior to that point. They have respect for the source material. They're not just farming source material because it's easy, cheap, or they're just trying to make a buck. I think they absolutely respect where that source material came from, and whether it's Marvel or DC, they truly are fans of the medium of comics itself. Walking Dead is a good example of exposing a really large audience to the fact that comic books are not just superheroes. Comic books are not a genre, they are a medium. That has definitely helped, I think, comic books as a medium itself, and it's made a lot of artists and writers use comics as a way to explore different ideas, different storytelling devices, and I think that's what's going to help comics grow. As long as they become that form of entertainment and storytelling that people are searching for, then that's what's going to help them grow and be sustainable, as opposed to gimmicks or tricks or even rock star artists and writers. It's got to be about entertainment. But I'd like to see it grow in different genres, in different areas. I'd like for it to maintain very tactile. I don't have a lot of complaints with digital media as far as comics are concerned. It's not a fear of mine that the paper is ever going to go away, because it just won't. It will change, it will migrate. There is digital media and there will be paper media. But my hope is that it just expands as a form of entertainment, and people more and more recognize that it's something that you can read on the bus. It's something that you can, take home as an adult or as a child. It's not just a child's medium. It's not just about capes and superheroes. That it can be a lot of different things.